One of the biggest enemies of anthropology is essentialization, trying to make something reduced to an essence, saying that, for example, race is about skin color, that would be a form of essentialization, or talking about a specific cultural group that is about their culture or their politics or whatever. And obviously, people are complex, and anthropology spends quite a bit of time trying to make sense of how you could, using a variety of tools, make a complex description of a complex cultural group. That being said, on Monday, we mentioned the definition that international law gives us of indigenous folks, starting with the priority in time with respect to the occupation and use of a specific territory. And in the context that we are talking about indigenous folks on the internet, that would mean looking at the first people on the internet. In that context, this would be the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the pages that existed on the internet as early as 1993, but were eventually taken down because there was just no more use for this particular organization. They were just restored in about 10 years ago as a symbol of the presence of this nuclear research association. There's also the screenshot that I posted here of the Verifus website on the internet, which looked like this exactly. Not very exciting, of course. This is just the beginning of trying to put stuff on a screen, and obviously their screens were much smaller than ours. Their computers were much slower than ours, so the internet was not very exciting, but it provided resources for people, and that's always been the case. We could also look back a little bit further to the ancestors of internet. If perhaps we have the internet as our modern definition, then the ancestors of the internet would be the indigenous representatives. ARPANET, for example, which started to exist in 1981 and was funded by the National Science Foundation and expanded to essentially create the TCP/IP protocol, which is how the internet works today. But once again, Department of Defense, Nuclear Research, National Science Foundation, we are talking about governments that exist otherwise and are not born on the internet themselves. They are born elsewhere and essentially colonizing the internet with their presence. There's also, as far as the definition given by the UN is concerned, the voluntary perpetuation of cultural distinctiveness, which may include the aspects of language, social organization, religion, and spiritual values, modes of production, laws, and institution, many of which we have mentioned before in this class, and it is not exactly clear whether or not we could or should go over them a whole lot more. But it is kind of an interesting thought experiment, finding the ways in which you could use the internet to communicate in specific ways, or especially to bring about certain ideas that we will associate with a form of culture, for instance. And there is certainly a very different aspect of that, even based on the text that I was showing earlier and what we have mentioned before as the email exchanges that existed on the internet from a very early time when the internet was mostly email based and there were very few sites going around. Those systems established ways of language and social organizations which today have mostly disappeared but still exist in a variety of ways. For example, there is Usenet, which started to appear in the 70s. And again, that's an email system that is linking computers and people and all kinds of organizations through a large amount of email downloads. Those email systems started with ARPANET before the internet, but became became extended to the modern ways that we use today. And the much larger sense in which we are talking about these practices has to do with the fact that the internet has historically been decentralized, been located around a variety of servers existing around the world and having an informal economy in which people are able to trade and barter the same way that, for example, tribes have done a long time ago. We mentioned that a little bit last week. And the larger idea that formal systems of religion or of culture might be existing in other kinds of ways, in ways in which people are reorganizing the more overbearing, more organized forms of religion, more organized form of culture, kind of rejecting those to be replaced by a new form of indigenous culture or indigenous organization on the internet anyway. So if the internet is the territory, or the websites are the territory, or the servers are the territory, we can start to look at different places in which different people started to create those forms of internet, especially the self-identification to a certain site, to a certain organization. That is the last aspect of the definition from the UN, the self-identification as well as recognition by other groups or by state authorities as a distinct collectivity. And that one is very easily relatable based on conversations we have had previously in this class, for example, with Anonymous. Anonymous is an organized group that has self-identified as anonymous based on the ways that people identify themselves on 4chan, and is today recognized as a valid source of information, as a state designated group by the US government because of their involvement in illegal activities. And to a certain extent, in social media representation, there are all kinds of views of what this Anonymous does as a self-identified indigenous internet group. And in that context, having its own logo, having its own slogan is certainly a big part of the branding of this group, but does it really qualify as an other organization, perhaps a quasi-corporation, even though there's not the same amount of capital, even though there's not all of the weird business aspect of it? There is certainly a certain aspect of self-promotion, a certain aspect of visibility that is not quite foreign to the regular ways in which brands appear on the internet. Now, could there be indigenous brands? Perhaps this is another one of the bigger conversation here. And the last aspect mentioned in the UN definition is an experience of subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, exclusion, or discrimination, whether or not those conditions persist. And unlike the conversation about the political organization, the economic organization, the experience of subjugation is something that will certainly be an important definition for indigenous folks, especially indigenous folks on the internet today, because anyone who feels subjugated, marginalized, dispossessed by a larger form of government will find some form of refuge on the internet, will find some form of counterpower on the internet where they can do their own activity, whatever it might be, away from the power of state government, away from the scrutiny of other groups that may be judging them. And that's something that was identified pretty early on in US culture as well. For example, through the movie Revenge of the Nerds here, where you have these nerds finding refuge on the internet from being subjugated by the other fraternities on their campus. And so the creation of a new fraternity that is designated for nerds, as the dedicated expression in the movie, is the beginning of this again not quite governmental, not quite commercial, not quite profitable form of organization that is based on the culture, and especially a culture that has a very digital element, even in the 80s when this was done. However, unlike what we talked about Monday with the Cyborg Manifesto, also dated from the 80s, this is very much a matter that is, as you can see in this picture, led by white males. And if you have seen the movie Revenge of the Nerds, it is not exactly based on any kind of aspect of social justice, maybe in the very broad sense of an equilibrium in the world. It is very much rooted in misogyny and kind of the existing faults of the larger Greek system and the larger school system, and obviously probably the larger government system. So there is a probably kind of a measure of nuance that has to be found here between people creating their own organization to create their own system of oppression, as opposed to people creating their own organization to avoid those systems of oppression, and perhaps again organizing themselves around those principles of freedom rather than the principle of essentially counterpower, which would mean a some form of freedom, but also would mean a form of oppression that exists, just a different one. And in the context of the internet, there was very much this early observation that the space provided by the internet could be used for all kinds of nefarious goals, including the repetition of existing forms of subjugation and marginalization. This paper here, dated from 1995, tells us about cyberspace described as a new frontier, but the notion of the new frontier is a mythic formulation constructed to bring the past into an organized and reinterpreted unity within the present and emphasize how the new territory is to be dominated and controlled in the future. The occupation of cyberspace has direct parallels with the colonization of non-Western cultures. Cyberspace is turning out to be the new other of Western civilization and is projecting all of its colonial prejudices. The images of sex and violence in which it's framed non-Western cultures onto the cyberspace. But this time, the darker side of the West is bouncing back on itself. So, in a sense, that there is a lack of rules, a lack of scrutiny, a lack of regulation, there is still very much the room for the formats of power and the formats of oppression and the formats of colonization to remain on the internet. Just like we could think of today our world as being a very colonized world where even though the people who are living currently in certain spaces are not indigenous, they feel indigenous. They feel like the natural citizens of the place where they are currently living because they have excluded and sometimes erased the people that existed before them. And in this context, kind of reinventing nature as this nature that they come from, as opposed to the nature in which the larger indigenous world existed, is very much part of this reinterpretation, this kind of romantic vision of the cyberspace or the digital space as a um, frontier means that there is something to be conquered, as opposed to there is a place where people can spend space, spend time, and spend effort and reorganize their societies. A kind of logical correlation to that is the context of what people tend to call new nomads or digital nomads. People, things, data move quite a bit on the internet, and that did not escape the commercial interest that you could very easily move your workforce across the world, and people would have to go where the work is. This website here, Digital Nomad World, is a website for people to find jobs across the world and travel around with others in this, what they call here, global community of digital nomads. Now, this is not nomadism in the sense of the anthropology that we would typically think of. These are not people who have a nomadic lifestyle. These are people who have a sedentary lifestyle that is attached all the way around the world. In the context of globalization, this makes sense. In the context of a digital indigeneity, this is not quite the idea that you would otherwise see from a hunting and gathering group, for example. These are people who are exploiting the spaces that exist and not necessarily using it for its natural resources. So, if we are talking about the practices of being indigenous and the possibility of moving around from site to site, from server to server, or even from workplace to workplace, the idea that is the romantic indigenous people who are the first to explore this new frontier is very much laden in a discourse that has to be kind of taken apart before we can even use this vocabulary of a digital nomad. This website here tends to see the attitudes of teens when it comes to being on the internet. And it was a survey that was done in high school, I think in Sweden, if I can read this properly. I can't really, but high school students and being asked about how they feel when it comes to social networks and websites. And as you can see here, there is a pretty wide disparity of attitudes that are perceived by different groups. So yeah, you can read the description on your own. Really, the number of participants was not sufficient to make general conclusion, as it is pointed out here, because this is done in one school. But this is still an observation that whether there is a larger discourse of freedom or a larger discourse of liberty and indigeneity and whatever, there is still very much a reproduction of existing cultural systems, non-indigenous systems that exist on the internet, with boys and girls having completely different experiences of what it means to be on the internet. The advantages are perceived as differently. The disadvantages are perceived differently, although when you get to the bottom of the list, you will find some pretty similar interests of fun and learning and identity and whatever. But the aspects of danger, for example, are perceived very differently. The aspects of communication are perceived differently because people have found on the internet the things that they were looking for and have not necessarily found the escape that you might have wanted it to be. So the internet perceived as a place of communication seems to be a very feminist idea, as opposed to the internet being also a dangerous place for many people. Again, this is not supposed to be the end all be all of how anything is working out. This is just one example of a larger context that I've mentioned today.